how can you tell the difference between someone who really wants to make the world better and someone who's just, really good at getting what they want? That's kind of what we're digging into today with this deep dive into Andrew Lester. This case really, I feel like, gripped the nation.
Yeah. It definitely got a lot of attention.
It really did.
And for good reason.
Yeah.
I mean, there are so many layers to it. I think just to level set, we're talking about back in April of 2023, 84-year-old Andrew Lester shot 16-year-old Ralph Yarl in Kansas City. And Yarl had just mistakenly rung Lester's doorbell thinking he was at the right address to pick up his younger brothers.
And that's where things get a little bit,
murky.
Yeah.
Complicated.
Because you have this initial release from custody, and there are all these protests, charges get filed, legal battles ensue, parts of the case even get sealed. And then now, as we're recording this in late 2024, we're learning that Lester's mental health is being evaluated.
It's a very twisty-turny kind of story. And I think it's really resonated with people for obvious reasons, right? It seems like everyone has an opinion. But what are the facts? What can we learn from this?
Yeah.
And how can we use the facts to maybe form, more sound opinions?
Right.
And so that's really what we're looking to do today. We're going to be pulling from articles from various sources: Sky News, Heavy, LBC, court documents, personal accounts from Lester's family, and even just the Wikipedia entry to try to give everybody a really solid picture of what went down.
Okay, so let's set the scene. Ralph Yarl, he's a gifted student. He's a musician. He was on track to have this really bright future.
Yeah.
He wanted to study chemical engineering at Texas A&M.
Smart kid.
Yeah, really smart kid. And so this all happens on the night of April 13th, 2023. He's just on his way to pick up his younger brothers from, a friend's house or wherever they are.
Yeah.
And he goes to the wrong address. It's literally just a block away from where he was supposed to be.
And that's, that little mistake
Changes everything.
Yeah, changed everything. He ends up at the house of Andrew Lester, rings the doorbell, and Lester, who's white, later claimed that he was scared to death by Yarl's size. He thought he was trying to break in.
I remember seeing pictures of Ralph Yarl, and, they said he was 5'8". He was 140 pounds. So to hear that Lester was, quote, scared to death, end quote, of him is...
it's strange.
Yeah, it's a little unsettling.
Yeah. It definitely adds like a layer of complexity to the whole story.
Yeah.
Because according to Yarl, there were no words exchanged, no interaction before Lester fired those 2 shots.
Through a glass door.
Through a glass door,
Yeah.
hitting him in the head and the arm.
Wow.
And Yarl, amazingly, was able to get up and actually ran to 3 different houses before somebody finally answered and called for help.
It's terrifying.
Yeah.
Even the initial police response to the shooting was kind of controversial. They did take Lester into custody, but they released him quickly, pending further investigation. And they didn't file any charges right away. So that's what sparked all the protests and the outrage in Kansas City. People wanted justice for Yarl.
Right, because it was just unimaginable to people that you could have this happen, that you could shoot a teenager on your doorstep, and seemingly there are minimal consequences, at least initially, right?
Yeah.
So that was a pivotal moment. And, one thing that's really important to think about as we go through all this is we have 2 very different accounts of what happened that night.
Right.
We have Lester insisting it was self-defense, saying he felt threatened. And then you have Yarl, who says he was shot without warning. No words were exchanged. And then to complicate things even further, there are conflicting viewpoints even among Lester's own family.
Sure.
For example, one of his grandsons alleged that Lester held negative views about minorities. Other family members disputed that.
Right.
So it's very messy.
It is. And then, of course, we have James Lynch. He's the neighbor who actually heard Yarl's cries for help, found him bleeding on the street, and he actually stayed with him, gave him aid and comfort while they were waiting for the paramedics to arrive.
Real stand-up guy.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you've got this clash of narratives. You've got Lester's claim of self-defense, and then you have Yarl's account of being shot without warning. And this is really like the heart of this case.
Yeah, and then 4 days after the shooting, Lester finally gets charged with first-degree assault and armed criminal action.
Yeah. So let's unpack that a little bit.
Okay.
First-degree assault in Missouri means you caused serious physical injury, and you did so with the intent to do so. Armed criminal action means you committed a felony while carrying a weapon.
Okay.
So in this case, that felony would be the assault. And so when you combine those 2 charges, it's basically like attempted murder in Missouri.
That makes the initial lack of charges even more confusing, like
Right.
what was going on there. The prosecutor in the case even said that he saw a racial component to the shooting, but...
Which raises the question, why wasn't he charged with a hate crime?
Yeah, exactly.
And the prosecutor explained that Missouri's hate crime laws actually carry weaker sentences than the charges that Lester was already facing. So it sounds like it was a strategic decision. He chose the charges that were most likely to result in the harshest penalty.
It's a grim strategy, but it does make sense.
Yeah.
And all this time, public support for Yarl was just, gaining momentum. A GoFundMe for his recovery raised over $2 million in just a matter of days. And even President Biden called Yarl and his mother to offer support.
That's amazing. It really shows you how much this case resonated with people all over the country.
Absolutely. And, I think for many people, this was more than just a news story. This was a young man who had his whole life ahead of him, and then just like that, everything changes because he rang the wrong doorbell. And the legal battle continued. Lester ended up pleading not guilty. He was released on bail. He set some dates for preliminary hearings. And then, in an unexpected turn of events, the judge agreed to partially seal the case. So now some of the evidence is actually shielded from public view.
Right. And that was at the request of Lester's attorney, who argued that all the media attention was just painting Lester in a negative light unfairly, and that it could hinder his right to a fair trial.
So where does that leave us? We've got these charges, we've got a partially sealed case, the public is outraged, and we have this young man who's trying to recover from this horrific experience.
So much to unpack still, and we're just getting started. This story, it doesn't end here. There are more layers that we're going to uncover as we go.
Last time we were talking about the charges against Andrew Lester. We talked about the case being partially sealed, the public outcry, and how Ralph Yarl was trying to recover. And of course, the legal system moves slow. And this case had more twists and turns coming.
Oh, yeah. Lots of twists and turns. I think one of the biggest things to happen was in September 2024, when just as the trial was about to start, it was delayed.
Okay.
Because Andrew Lester was ordered to undergo a mental health evaluation.
Oh, wow. So that's a pretty big deal. What kind of impact did that have?
Well, it definitely, it adds another layer of complexity here, because Lester's attorney argued that his mental health had declined quite a bit because of all the stress from, the death threats, the media scrutiny. He was separated from his wife at that point, and all of this was just too much for him.
It makes you wonder, if he is found to have mental health issues that contributed to what happened, does that reduce his responsibility in any way?
Yeah, that's a tough question.
Yeah.
And it's something that the courts have been struggling with for a really long time. It really makes you think about the connection between individual responsibility and mental health. Where's the line? I think that's a conversation that goes way beyond this particular case.
Absolutely. But while all this was happening, Ralph Yarl's family wasn't just waiting around.
Right. In April 2024, Yarl's mother actually filed a civil lawsuit against Lester. And this is interesting, also against the Homeowners Association.
So on top of the criminal charges, now he's dealing with a civil lawsuit. What does that actually mean for him? What are they alleging?
Well, the lawsuit, of course, alleges negligence on the part of Lester, but also alleges racial animus and negligence on the part of the Homeowners Association.
So they're kind of saying that the Homeowners Association had something to do with this as well. What does that tell us?
Well, it tells us that they think that the HOA, the Homeowners Association, bears some responsibility for what happened, maybe because they didn't address concerns about Lester's behavior in the past, or maybe they have a history of ignoring safety issues. It really kind of expands the responsibility here beyond just Lester himself.
Makes you wonder, could this whole thing have been avoided if they had done something differently? It's a question that we're left with even now as these legal battles are going on.
Definitely. And speaking of these legal battles, we can't forget the most important part of this whole thing, Ralph Yarl. Thankfully, he has physically recovered from his injuries.
To be shot in the head and recover, that's amazing. And he's starting his senior year of high school, beginning to rebuild his life. That's really inspiring to see.
He's incredibly resilient. But it's important to keep in mind that, true justice goes beyond the physical healing. There are emotional and psychological wounds that are probably going to stay with him for a while.
Yeah. It's a lot. So we've talked about the charges, the lawsuits, the mental health evaluations, all this stuff. It's easy to get caught up in the legal side of things. But before we move on, let's just think about the human cost. This young man, with his whole life ahead of him, now has to deal with the effects of this horrible event.
It's a pretty powerful reminder that these aren't just abstract legal cases, These are real people. This had a huge impact on real lives. And the effects are going to be felt far beyond the courtroom.
It's a lot to think about. Here we have this young man trying to get back to a normal life. We have this legal system trying to figure out all these conflicting accounts. And then we have society, as a whole, being forced to face some really uncomfortable truths about race, fear, and the potential for violence in everyday life.
Yeah, it's about more than Andrew Lester and Ralph Yarl. It's about us, the choices we make, the assumptions that we hold, and the world we want to live in.
There's still a lot of unanswered questions.
Yeah, and that's why we have to keep looking into this.
Yeah.
There's a lot more to understand. There are a lot more lessons to be learned from this case. We're not done.
So we've spent all this time really digging into the Andrew Lester case, the legal battles, the different stories from each side, and how it's affected everyone. It's a lot. But now I kind of want to take a step back and ask, what does this all tell us? What are those big lessons we can learn from this, the things that go beyond just the news headlines?
Yeah.
I
think this case, it really forces us to confront some uncomfortable things about how bias plays out in our society. I mean, it's troubling, say the least, that Lester saw Ralph Yarl as a threat immediately. Yarl's a black teenager. Lester didn't even exchange any words with him, didn't even really see him clearly.
It makes you think, how often do we do that?
Right.
Without realizing it? How often does that unconscious bias change how we see others? And especially, I feel like, in those situations where we're stressed or scared.
It's definitely something we should all think about. I mean, this case is a pretty stark reminder that race still plays a huge role in how we see and interact with each other. And it's not always intentional or, out in the open, but it can have these devastating consequences.
We've talked about the legal side of things, but what about the emotional and psychological aspects of this? Lester said he was scared to death. But how much of that was real? Was it just fear? Or was it because of stereotypes and prejudices?
It's really hard to know for sure, but it does bring up a lot of questions about fear and how it connects to things like race and perception. Right. This case also brings up the stand your ground laws.
Yeah.
So you can use deadly force if you believe you're in danger. And there's been so much debate about those laws. How do those laws apply when you're dealing with, the possibility of implicit bias?
That's the thing. Those laws really depend on how someone perceives a threat. But what happens when that perception is distorted because of unconscious biases? It's dangerous.
Yeah, it is.
I mean, as we saw, it can end tragically.
Exactly. It's a hard conversation to have, but we have to have it as a society.
Absolutely. I mean, look at all the outrage this case has caused. All the discussion it sparked. We have to take all that energy and make something good come from it. We have to create change.
I totally agree. And one thing that really stood out to me was how much support Ralph Yarl received.
Yeah.
The protests, the donations, people demanding justice for him. It showed that we're not okay with this kind of injustice. And Ralph himself, he's so resilient.
Yeah.
I mean, the way he's focused on healing and moving forward with his life, it's incredible.
He's an amazing young man. It would be so easy to just get caught up in anger after something like this. But he's decided to focus on healing and rebuilding his life. It's powerful.
It really is. It shows the power of the human spirit, You can overcome even the most terrible things. And it makes me hopeful. We need stories like his. They remind us that even after something awful, there's still hope, there's healing, and there's a future.
So as we wrap things up here, I think we have to remember that this isn't just about Andrew Lester or Ralph Yarl. It's about all of us. We need to understand how powerful implicit bias is. We need to think about what fear can do, how it can be dangerous. And we have to create a society that's fair for everyone.
It's about asking ourselves the tough questions.
Yeah.
How can we make things better? What can we do to make sure a young man going to pick up his brothers doesn't end up being shot because of the color of his skin?
Right. It's a challenge for all of us, but it's something we have to pay attention to. It's something we have to be empathetic about, and we have to do something about it. We may not have the answers, but we have to start by asking the right questions. Thanks for being here with us on this deep dive. I hope this gives you all something to think about, something to talk about, and hopefully it will give you the push you need to go out and do something.